Hello there, this is Adam Anderson and welcome to the Anderson System. Benjamin is taking a break in inner world. And so today I want to talk to you guys about inner world versus outer world confusion. Now, it can happen to alters, or it's happened to me. It has happened pretty much to every alter within our system that we have confusion when it comes to the inner world versus the outer world. You may ask me, well, what does that mean? In other words, as a alter, it's easy to get confused about the two different realities because when you're in the inner world, things operate in they are pretty much are different in the inner world. You know, in the inner world, you may have a particular job or a particular thing you're doing, or even a particular type of physics that may be implemented in your inner world. Like, in other words, inner world can be very different depending on each system. In our system, we have different jobs and different positions and different way of life that we have in our inner world. And so when we have our inner world tends to mirror the desires and even the things that we wanted as a child. And even as we grow up in our teenage years and our preteen years as well, even in some of our adult years too, our inner world has changed or has become more I will say, more metropolitan. You could say more like city-like. And so it kind of developed from like Disney World or Disneyland to more like New York City, kind of like that's how it kind of looks, where it's more business-like and more where it's coffee shops, it has subways. My inner world has jobs, people that work jobs in the inner world, different alters. Those alters that are only in front working in the inner world, they have their office jobs or whatever kind of job they want, whether it's cashier or bus driver, whatever job it may be. There's tons of occupations in our inner world. And so when an alter would front in our system and they come into the outer world, in other words, the reality of the five senses, the outer world that most singlets know, most everybody knows, the outer world, is that sometimes those things can be very confusing to the alter, because the alter doesn't have that job that they had when they were in the world, because now it's different and now they're in the outer world and our job may be different. And so an example of that would be when I went to a job interview and I had a resume. My resume said something completely different than what I was presenting during the interview, because the resume I had was actually from an alter and he uploaded that resume and it was his thing that he did in the inner world, his occupation, what he did. And so it was kind of hard to explain to the future employer what was going on. And of course, I didn't get the job, but it was kind of strange because an employer doesn't know what a protector is. They don't know what that means. Like, okay, you say you were a protector in the inner world. What does that mean? Like, that will throw an employer for a loop. They don't understand what that means. And so sometimes it will cause confusion because that alter sometimes will have the mentality of being in the inner world when they're really operating in the outer world, if that makes any sense. So it's very confusing. So it's like going from Earth to Mars or to a different solar system or planet. Because if I go to a different planet, it'll be different. If I go to a different solar system, whatever, it'll be different. In other words, it's a completely different atmosphere or an environment. And so that can cause confusion with your alters. If your alters can be confused because they don't understand sometimes that, gee, I'm in the outer world, so things are a little bit different here. And they gotta kind of get caught up to what's going on. And sometimes some alters, at least in my system, don't communicate with other alters. And so one alter will do one thing and doesn't tell the other alter about what they did in the outer world. And so it's like playing catch up. And sometimes people may think that we may be lying or whatever because we're trying to figure this whole thing out. And it gets very, very, very confusing, to say the least, extremely confusing. And so, trying to get a job saying you are a protector in the world does not get you a job in the real world. And it was kind of confusing for the employer that I interviewed with. And I, of course, didn't get a job. It was a stupid seasonal job, and I'm still looking now for seasonal work. And so interviews that's a whole nother ball game when it comes to interviewing. I'm actually going to do a video about that, by having DID and interviewing and how that can just fuck up your whole day. And so anyway, it's very confusing sometimes for alters when they're used to being in the world and they translate and go into the outer world, and the whole thing is completely different and they're confused, and sometimes they don't convey the information in the correct way. And so hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. And I'd like to know about your system as well. If you have DID or OSD, or if you're just a plural system, I'd like to know your experience. And so anyway, this is Adam Anderson signing off. Bye-bye.